The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy.
Hello and welcome to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. My name is Josh Edison and I'm getting a cold, I think. It feels like one's coming on. He's also in Dentith, he's in Bucharest, Romania, and not getting a cold, from what I can...
I've got a slightly scratchy throat, but that might have been the drinking last night. We're having a whole bunch of activities at the New Europe College this week, which means a whole bunch of former fellows have turned up to attend these things. And as is customary, you must take former fellows out for drinks at bars they used to go to when they were at the New Europe College. And thus there is carousing and excitable conversation, and maybe there's melodramatic shouting in the middle of the night as you try to propound points that people find ridiculous, which can lead to sore throats, and thus possibly the scratchiness at the back of my throat is due to a slight exuberance.
Yes.
Exuberance.
Self-inflicted anyway.
Everything I do is self-inflicted.
Whereas I assume
every disease is self-inflicted. I'm just an experimental melting pot of diseases when it comes to the medical.
You and your petri...
Well, this is going in a weird direction.
Actually, you are slightly freezing from time to time. Am I sounding all right at your end?
Yes, you are absolutely fine. Do we want to disconnect and try again, or just persevere?
I think we'll persevere. Technology will be our saviour, I assume. But anyway, it's kind of it's that time of year again where anniversaries occur. The very first episode of this podcast ever in the world ever went online on May the 20th, 2014. We're recording this on May the 17th, 2018. So if my mathematics serves me correctly, it's been 5,000 years since we began recording. That's pretty good.
My God, we're older than Moses and Ezekiel put together.
So quite the anniversary to be celebrating there, I suppose.
Actually, no, hold on. You're saying we started recording this 5,000 years ago, and yet the Earth, as we know, is only 4,004, maybe 4,008 years old. So you're saying we started recording this podcast before creation even began?
I think I was talking...
Are you saying that we are angelic beings?
Well, yes.
And our podcast predates the world?
Not necessarily. I think I was talking in podcast years, which is sort of like dog years, I think.
So every 8 years equals 1 year?
Something like that. So, yes. It's an anniversary. Just an anniversary, for goodness sake.
Where inanity is order of the day.
But yes, if it's been 5,000 pod years or 4 of your Earth years since we began podcasting, that means it's also been 4 years since the disappearance of Flight MH370, which was one of the first things we ever talked about. And we're going to be doing it again.
In our 4th ever episode.
Well, there we go. It's 4s all round. 4 square. I don't know why I just said that. But before we start talking about MH370 for the 5,000th time, I assume, we should probably get a news update out of the way.
We should indeed.
Breaking conspiracy theories in the news.
This week we have a little bit of a weird news and conspiracy update section, in that in Aotearoa, New Zealand at least, the biggest slice of conspiracy news has been on the main topic of this week's episode, the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines flight MH370.
Long-term listeners will be doubtless aware that we covered the disappearance of MH370 as one of our first shows in this exciting series of podcasts. And given we are about to celebrate our 4th anniversary...
Jesus, we've been doing this for how long? Shouldn't we be looking into enrolling this podcast into a local primary or elementary school?
Given we are about to celebrate our 4th anniversary, and the fact that the local news has been awash with MH370 theorising, a lot of what we might have covered here is going to be covered after the chime.
Which brings us to an interesting issue about these news segments, since we have to pick and choose our feature content from week to week anyway, so how's this any different?
Because, Josh, this week's folder of news is replete only with MH370 stuff. Oh, and the usual Trump material, but frankly that's getting so tired, I'm now with the GOP. Let's just pretend nothing happened and move on already.
Fine. If you've been ignoring the other exciting conspiracy theory news, let me take the initiative. We have stories about New Zealand and Australia trying to counter China via a rugby team, and how the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Fonterra tried to cover up the fact that they wanted the previous Prime Minister of New Zealand to open a factory in St. Petersburg.
Okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, tell me about that rugby team.
Well, first some background. It's taken to be a given that China is seeking to become the next or newest superpower, but unlike the US, which arguably has tried to maintain its dominance with the old world system of having its military everywhere, something which stretches resources like anything, China is seeking what is sometimes called soft power or soft dominance, which is a kind of cultural thing. Rather than make countries allied or reliant on China via military might, China seems to simply influence the culture of the target countries first by making said countries sympathetic towards China and then culturally compatible with China.
So this is meant to explain things like China building police stations and public infrastructure and the like throughout the Pacific, claiming they're being charitable and wanting nothing in return for their investments?
Precisely. Now, we get on to whether this is working out in a minute, but the idea that China is purchasing influence via its investments in the Pacific is something that's worried people in both Australia and here at home, because not all of China's interests end up being in our own interests. As such, there's a bit of cultural Cold War going on in the Pacific, with Western colonised nations like our own pushing back against the cultural colonialism of China.
With Pacifica people with their own cultures and values kind of caught in between.
Well, yes, there is something off about Australia and New Zealand thinking China should butt out of Pacifica politics when we go around telling them how to run their lives anyway. But anyway, rugby. As you know, I'm literally the world's biggest sports fan, so I know absolutely everything about rugby. It features at least one ball, 2 goal posts, more than 3 players. They play games, and sometimes somebody wins.
Well, I'm convinced by your sports ball. Please continue.
Yes. So, part of the plan to reduce China's cultural imperium is a proposed Pacific rugby team, an All Blacks for Polynesia, basically, because rugby is apparently the most important thing in the Southern Hemisphere, which, if you believe the news, is basically true. Such a team, because of the sport's link to both New Zealand and Australia, would be a kind of cultural ambassador for our way of doing things, which would combat China's increasing influence in the Pacific.
Okay, so what's the conspiracy angle?
I'm glad you asked. For one thing, combating China is not the stated reason for creating the team. Apparently it's all about making sure there's a Pacific team in the Super Rugby tournament. But it's very interesting that the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade, MFAT, were the ones to run a feasibility study about setting up the team rather than, say, the various sports ministries and the like. Plus, China is not exactly admitting that they're building all that infrastructure in the Pacific for their own good.
Yes, what is it that China are meant to want?
Well, you might recall that China came out in support of Japan over the whole commercial whaling thing. China did mention this to various Pacific communities they'd supported previously, telling them that they might want to side with Japan.
What happened?
Well, not much. The Pacific nations thanked China for their earlier work, but voted with New Zealand and Australia against Japan. So it's not clear that the cultural imperium is quite getting China what it wants, but it's also early days.
Okay, so that one story. Now tell me the goss about Russia.
This one also features the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade, as well as dairy giant Fonterra. Basically, they wanted then Prime Minister Bill English to open a factory as part of a joint venture with Russia in St. Petersburg.
And this is conspiratorial how?
Well, the first is the simple fact that no New Zealand Prime Minister has visited Russia in nearly 2 decades. Secondly, MFAT and Fonterra kept this very, very quiet, probably because of the whole Crimea thing at the time. It might antagonise other trade partners. There's also the fact that the Prime Minister's office is saying it was only a suggestion, with others saying it was a much more concrete plan, which has led to suspicion that someone's either overplaying or underplaying their hand in the matter. Plus...
Yes?
Well, the other thing which is interesting is that the new government, which is currently led by Acting Prime Minister Winston Peters...
Currently in line for a daytime Emmy for his performance.
He was pushing for a free trade deal with Russia until relatively recently. So there's some interest or concern about Russia interfering or influencing people back home?
More cultural imperium?
Basically, yes.
And this has what to do with MH370?
Nothing.
And everything?
Yes.
And no.
Right, so that's that out of the way. We're here to talk about MH370, and damn it if that's not what we're going to do right now.
Now the big question, is this going to be the last time we ever talk about MH370?
Only if we choose to, I imagine. Certainly, there have been, I want to say recent developments, although you can gather they're not that recent, it's just that they recently surfaced. But certainly nothing has happened issue to rest conclusively, so I imagine it's to dog us from now until the end of, or at least until they actually find the airplane at the bottom, presumably, and get something more concrete. But we can give a good survey of the history and present of MH17 conspiracy theory, unless we want to declare, much like our moratorium on Trump or Trumpatorium, we could have an MH370 torum purely by, but
But it just doesn't run, does it?
No.
Emanatorium. So no, it's just not going to work. A trumpetorium, you can talk about them all the time. Even though the more I say that word, the more ridiculous and nonsensical it becomes, just like the American president after. Zing.
satire.
Oh yes, sick burn, I believe the kids call that. Sick burn.
They do. Yes, so I think MH370 will be with us and therefore with this podcast for years to come. But right now, as we say, it's just part. It was April 2014 that it went missing, wasn't it? Just slightly before we started actually recording the podcast in earnest. So it's past the 4-year mark, and seeing that it's been the anniversary, there's been renewed talk about it. In particular, an article on 60 Minutes. Where people laid forth their current theory for what happened to MH370. Did you manage to see that article? I have
No,
not.
because it's region locked in Romania, and I've not been able to find a copy of it online that I've been able to watch. But luckily, the New Zealand Herald has been breathlessly reporting everything in it, and also reporting what wasn't in the news story.
Yes, so I don't really feel that I've been that I've been left out. So I suppose the first thing we should say is that, as far as I'm aware, the official theory, quote unquote, at least the theory accepted by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, is one which we've said this before in previous updates, is that there was some sort of problem, probably a fire, some sort of failure on the aircraft, which resulted in a loss of cabin pressure, which rendered the crew and passengers unconscious, and the plane went off course and just drifted until it ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. But that is not the favoured theory of a bunch of other people, certainly not the people who showed up in the 60 Minutes article. Their pet theory, and again, this is something that we have talked about before. It's not a brand new theory by any measure. Is that the disappearance of flight MH370 was essentially a case of murder-suicide by one of the captains. That it was a deliberate act. That this person, again, they suggest possibly caused depressurization, rendering their passengers unconscious. I'm not quite sure about that one. But then, yes, deliberately flew into the middle of the ocean and crashed the plane there.
Okay, what's the evidence for this particular hypothesis?
Right, well, there's some evidence and some sort of speculation. One of the people they talk about in the article is where are all the names here? Simon Hardy. He's a senior Boeing 777 pilot and a flight instructor. He, having looked at the tracking of the plane's flight path from military satellites, apparently, we do know a bit about where it flew before it eventually disappeared. He claims that they show a deliberate attempt to evade detection, essentially. Supposedly, the flight, when it sort of veered off course, the flight path it took meant it sort of zigzagged it basically flew in a straight line that kind of went along the border of Malaysia and Thailand, which meant the plane was essentially passing from Malaysian airspace to Thai airspace and back again fairly frequently. And so he believed that that was done on purpose because that would have the effect of when the Malaysian air traffic controllers would see a plane show up in Malaysian airspace, they think, oh, what's that one? It wasn't supposed to be here. But then when it disappears back into Thai airspace, they think, oh, okay, it must have been, must have just been a Thai aeroplane that went off slightly off course, and vice versa with the Thai air traffic controllers. The idea was that you'd fly this way in order to basically trick people on both sides into thinking you were not their problem, and so they wouldn't pay attention to you. And the quote he gave was that if you were commissioning me to do this operation and try to make a 777 disappear, I would do exactly the same thing.
Which does suggest that Simon Hardy has spent a lot of time thinking about how he would kill people using planes.
That's a slight worry, but yeah, so that's, I mean, yeah, as I say, it's not proof positive. It's supposition based on the available evidence. He followed this up by saying that having flown in that direction, the plane. The quote they give is dipped the wing. It sort of turned over the Malaysian state of Penang before it then veered off into the middle of the Indian Ocean. And Mr. Hardy was thinking about what he could explain the flying between the borders of the two countries, but that last little dip before veering off into the ocean, he found a little bit odd until it occurred to him that this captain, Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, is from the Malaysian state of Penang apparently, and so the claim was that this man, having decided to commit suicide by aeroplane and take an aeroplane load of passengers with him, was taking one last look at his hometown before heading off into oblivion. So that's all kind of supposition. There's also the whole flight recorder thing, and this I'm still not sure about this because I've read conflicting accounts here. According to some sources, people obviously in the investigation in the aftermath of the crash, they looked into the two captains in fairly great detail to see if this sort of scenario is plausible. According to some accounts, flight simulation software on Captain Shah's home computer showed him mapping out a course very similar to the course that the plane that MH370 ended up taking. Yeah, I've read some things that say this, leaked documents said as much, but then also that wasn't quite true. Also, that the ATSB, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, said yes, we did find stuff like that on his home computer, but it didn't prove anything. The spokesman from the Malaysian government said that quote unquote nothing sinister had been found on it. So I'm not actually sure what to make of the evidence there, but that seems to be the guts of this theory. And it was not just Simon Hardy. They also talked to Captain Mike Keane, who was a former chief pilot on EasyJet, British airline. They talked to Larry Vance, who was a senior investigator with the Transport Safety Board of Canada. And these people have been saying this for a while now. This theory didn't just come out of the blue. So it's a little bit. I'm not sure what to make of this documentary now. Is it just because it was a news agency or 60 Minutes could get a bit of viewership by putting on a documentary that puts forward a striking alternative theory to the official one around the anniversary of the plane's disappearance, or perhaps is there more to this theory than it might appear?
Well, the other very likely hypothesis here is that one of these people has written a book, and the book is coming out, and the 60 Minutes piece essentially is a big promotional thing to go buy my book. Because I believe Larry Vance has a book coming out about MH370.
He does. Coming out, or has recently come out? I don't have it in my notes here. But
and so the 60 Minutes thing basically seems to be a fairly substantial ad for someone's book with their hypothesis about what happened with MH370. Which, of course, leads us to the question, what aren't we being told? Because this entire theory does seem to rely upon making inferences about one of the pilots and claiming, well, the reason why the plane dipped its wing and flew over Penang was because he came from Penang and he wanted to wave goodbye to his hometown. And that is our explanation for this rather weird event. So what do we know about the psychology of the individuals involved? Because that doesn't seem to be part of the story here.
Well, yes, that's just it. In fact, this is one of the things, as you mentioned, the Herald made a great show of reporting on the article, and then also shortly thereafter put up another news story saying what was missing, what didn't this theory tell you? And the first thing they mention, and the first thing you would possibly think about, was this theory gives no mention of motive. It doesn't seek to give any sort of explanation for the extreme act, you would say, of not just committing suicide, but committing suicide and taking a 777 full of passengers with you. That's surely not a decision that would be taken lightly, and yet they supply, and we're not aware of, no reason why the pilots would want to do this. Pilots are psychologically tested from time to time to make sure they're fit to be flying. Apparently neither of the pilots, or rather both of the pilots had passed the usual psych tests. I believe there have been no signs of financial problems in either of their lives, which is often one of the key motivators for this sort of these sorts of suicidal urges, but basically no one that I'm aware of has put forward any sort of motive.
Now, of course, this is a conspiracy theory here because the experts referred to in the 16 Minutes documentary are claiming that based upon the evidence they present, evidence which they say isn't contested by either Malaysia Airlines or the ASTB, which is the pattern by which the plane flew and things like that, that no one could make an inference that it wasn't a murder-suicide attempt. Ipso facto, the fact that the official theory remains there was an accident on board, everyone passed out, and the plane just flew until such time it crashed, is in fact a cover-up because either someone in the Malaysian government or someone with the ASTB do not want to admit to what really happened, and thus they are putting out disinformation of some kind.
So the Herald article, the What's Missing from This Theory article, goes on to basically just brings up a couple of other competing conspiracy theories, really, of which there have been plenty. So the two the Herald mentions is the fact that a group called the Chinese Martyrs Brigade apparently claimed responsibility for the disappearance of MH370 just days after the plane vanished. But at the time, people were sceptical of it and said that there was no evidence to show that it wasn't just a hoax. The other one the article mentions is the fact that two Iranian men on the flight were both travelling on forged and stolen passports, which on the face of it, when that information came out, led people to think, well, what was this terrorism? Was this a terrorist event? Although the consensus seems to be that those two men were travelling on faked documents because they were asylum seekers trying to get to another country to claim asylum. So I'm not quite sure why the Herald picked just those two particular little factoids to throw up as competing conspiracy theories, because there's been a lot of them in the past, and we've talked about them in the past.
A lot of them.
Indeed, I believe we had an episode where we went over an article that listed out 13 different conspiracy theories. Do you want to give us a quick rundown of the standout ones of those?
Well, yes. So you had the standard US military conspiracy theory, which was also the Chinese government military conspiracy theory, claiming that either this was a military experiment with remote piloting of planes, or that the vessel itself had been shot down by one of those militaries because it had been accidentally marked as being an enemy vehicle of some particular kind. Then we had the Afghani hijacking story, which also appears to be the same version of the Iranian story. There were two people with false passports on the plane. Ipso facto, they were terrorists. Ipso facto, they took over the plane. Ipso facto, people fought back. Ipso facto, the plane crashed. Ipso facto, the universe ends with the heat death of all things. It's just a logical progression from one thing to another.
I have to say.
Well, you know me and my ipso factos. I like
do.
to slip them in whenever possible.
I do know.
And this was a story which had a lot of traction when we had no flight data. So in the initial reporting, where we still really had no idea what was going on. So this was before the information came out that certain computer components on the planes were sending data back live to Boeing, which is how we learnt so much about the movements of the flight before it disappeared. The fact that there were people travelling on the plane with false passports was taken to be a bit of a red flag at the time, because it was we don't know what's happened to this flight. Could it have been a terrorist hijacking? Then, of course, you get the slightly more unusual ones. There was the claim that this was an alien abduction event. So the plane disappeared because it's been taken into space. Not many people believe that one. No. There was also claims it was a life insurance scam, that people had taken money out on people on board the planes, and thus they were going to get an absolute windfall. That doesn't seem to have occurred, and that you would kind of think if it were a life insurance scam, people would have noticed by now, in case of, Mr. Jerry Rig, you seem to have put a life insurance claim on 127 people who all conveniently just disappeared. This is a perfectly normal thing. We'll, of course, give you your cash payment out immediately. Non-consecutive bills, you say? Why, certainly, sir. We'll make sure that's ready for you immediately. Going back to the more unusual ones, the Illuminati were, of course, blamed. This was due to a person known online only as I Am Sherlocked, who apparently uncovered that the Boeing 777 in question was the 404th aircraft to be produced by Boeing. And, of course, a 404 error online means page not found, which is oddly appropriate, they claimed, for the status of the aircraft. Or just a coincidence? Coincidence? I think not, was their claim. So ipso facto, the Illuminati once again... See, I just slipped another ipso facto in there.
You can't stop yourself, you're a maniac.
It's true, it's almost volcanic, the way that I'm just spouting ipso factos from moment to moment.
It's not going to work.
No, this is an in-joke that Josh is trying to get me to say a particular phrase, and I'm hinting towards it, and he's just not finding a way to make me say it this episode. So, yes, the Illuminati apparently once again encoding information about their nefarious plans in everyday events. Then, of course, Edward Snowden was blamed. It's one of those things that 4 years ago, Edward Snowden was kind of the villain behind a lot of things going on in the world. And this is pre the Russian collusion stuff, so now Julian Assange has taken that particular role. But Edward Snowden was taken to be a villainous mastermind behind a whole bunch of bad things, including at the time the disappearance of MH370. Another version of the military conspiracy theory stuff, electronic warfare experiments, so remote hijacking of the plane, which either went disastrously wrong or disastrously right. So there were a lot of stories going on back in the day about the plane being remotely hijacked and then taken to an airfield in some country where the passengers were disembarked and then either immediately killed or forced into slavery or given new identities. There was a military takeout or secret weapon at work. That's once again just another example. of the military hypothesis, pilot suicide, which we've already covered, and then, of course, things like it was in the Asian Bermuda Triangle. So apparently other vessels have disappeared, although that's actually not a particularly interesting hypothesis because ships and things disappear all the time. So you can create triangles anywhere in the world by going, oh, 2 or 3 ships have disappeared here. That must be the Hertfordshire Triangle or the Devonport Triangle or the Asia Bermuda Triangle, which just seems a bit weird.
Yes.
And of course there was the patent conspiracy theory, which was the hypothesis that there were certain people travelling on the plane with rather important patents who then died. And that theory kind of fell apart for the sheer fact that just because someone who registers a patent dies doesn't mean the patent suddenly becomes null and void, because they're usually invested in countries and also are inheritable. So unless you're trying to kill your grandfather who patented something on a plane, which sounds like an episode of Murder, She Wrote, it's not the most compelling hypothesis for the disappearance of MH370. And as we noted at the time, some of these just aren't even conspiracy theories, despite what the list claims. They're simply explanations as to how someone might commit a murder. There was no cover-up involved. They were just, murder could be committed this way. It's murder, they wrote.
And yes, I mean, at the time there were a few of those were fairly implausible just on the face of it, and some of them have become less plausible now that we know more about what actually happened. Sometime after that one was written, about a year ago now, I think, there was another conspiracy theory similar to the Iranian fake passport business. When some people noticed a discrepancy in the official record around how many people were actually on the plane, there was it listed 239 people on the plane, and then yet only talked about 226 passengers and 12 crew, which once again, if my mathematics serves me, claims that there were actually 5,000 people on that aeroplane. Apparently this was all just a mistake, and there are only 227 passengers, which still, by my mathematics, comes to 5,000 people on that. I'm beginning to think I don't know how to add, Matthew. Is it not just sticking equals 5,000 on the end of every equation?
Now, at this particular point in time, 4 years ago, when we initially talked about MH370, you mentioned a particular film I had never watched about time travelers from the future snatching people from planes.
Oh yes, Millennium. Have you watched it in the interim?
I have watched it in the interim. The one thing you didn't warn me about was the really, really bad robot makeup.
Well, yes. Yeah. But the rest of it was good.
Yes, but the really bad robot makeup is just ever so slightly unsettling.
What about the weird council of elders floating in tanks, all weird and Clive Barker-ish all of a sudden, compared to the rest of the film?
It's true. There is a kind of almost Brazil 12 Monkeys aspect to how the future is portrayed, which I think because the film is it's made after Brazil but before 12 Monkeys is kind of interesting.
And I did think it did a very good job of the sort of, multiple time loop business of him encountering her, and he doesn't know her but she knows him, and then realizes, oh, that must mean I'm going to have to go back and meet him again, and then it follows her timeline and loops back around. I thought it did quite well of that. Anyway,
and also the interesting plot point about smoking.
And but yes, Millennium, starring Chris Christopherson, is it?
It's true.
And
his parents liked Chris so much they named him twice.
It's a good film. You should go and see it. Science fiction, time travel, disappearing aeroplanes. I give it 2 thumbs up.
And bad robot makeup.
Bad robot. Yes, there is a sort of androidy robot character whose robot makeup is not spectacular, but it was 1990 or something when it was made, so they could be forgiven a little bit of dodgy prosthesis, surely.
It's true.
We've all had a dodgy prosthesis from time to time.
That's also true.
But back to MH370, so that's kind of where it is now. A friend of ours quite wittily said on Twitter, I don't know if he listens to this podcast, but if he does, nice one, John, that speculation about what happened to MH370 is becoming the new I know who Jack the Ripper was. At the moment, at least, until someone does actually manage to find the plane, find the black box or what have you, with the evidence that's available, there can be lots of speculation in lots of different directions, but it doesn't seem like we have enough to actually produce anything definite at all.
No, unfortunately not. At this stage, we have the official theory, which accident on board leading to depressurization, everyone turning unconscious. Turning unconscious? Becoming unconscious? Falling unconscious. And then eventually the plane crashing versus a new hypothesis, which is actually an old hypothesis, that it was a murder-suicide attempt, which may or may not be driven by the fact that there's someone who's writing a book on this who needs a bit of publicity. Because let's face it, probably releasing a book about MH370 3 years ago would have guaranteed you a bestseller. But the MH370 story hasn't really persisted.
No.
It's kind of gone off the boil. And whilst it is an interesting story, you probably do need some kind of advertising campaign. And the kind of free advertising you get from a 60 Minutes segment kind of guarantees someone's going to buy your book.
So I think that's basically it. In a year's time, if this podcast is still around and celebrating its 5th anniversary, it will also, I'm sure, be discussing the 5th anniversary of the disappearance of Flight MH370. And who knows, maybe there will be actually something more definite to say about it. But as of right now, doesn't look like it.
No, unfortunately, it's just come to its end.
It's end.
Like we've come to our end.
We certainly have. So, just a recap of something we mentioned last week. There is going to be a steady stream, I'm not sure, of exclusive content bursting forth from the mouth of M. Like some sort of...
It's true. Some kind of set of volcanoes along the Ring of Fire. And I'm going to be producing spurts of podcasty goodness.
Of your own essential spirit.
It's true. My own essential spirit will be bubbling up through the earth, producing podcasts.
Look, for reasons I can't fully explain or remember, we did want to get the phrase "jizz volcano" into this episode. I don't know why. It doesn't make any sense, but now I've just said it. It's there now.
You have. Although the attempt was to try to make me to say it.
To make you say it, yes. Oh, Matthew said it while we were setting up, and I was like, haha, that would be a good clip to put on the end or something. Did you record that? And he said no. So then we thought we'd have to bring it up again, but we wanted it to happen organically, but we failed. I personally failed. I take full responsibility.
You did. You are a failure, Joshua. You are a failure.
But anyway, this bonus content by the good doctor for our patron fans. Now, there was a slight snafu with getting the first issue out exclusively. It certainly showed up in my podcast feed, and I'm not actually...
But then it disappeared.
Oh, did it disappear? Okay, so if you were attentive, you might have actually caught the first little patrons-only update for free. But rest assured, there'll be no more freeloading for you non-patron sponges. We love you. You're our audience. Please keep listening.
Yes. Please do keep listening.
You don't have to be patrons. We don't. We just want the attention, quite frankly.
Although if you do want to be a sponge, be a sponge. Be the sponge you want to be. There's nothing wrong with sponges. Sponges are essential for the ecosystem of the ocean.
Right, well, I believe we've come to the end of an episode, and I'm no longer required to do a whole bit of administrative rambling now that we have our little soundbite to go on the end. So... I'm at a bit of a loss, really. All I can think of to say is goodbye. Is there anything?
Not Jizz Volcano?
Not Jizz Volcano. We've been there, done that. It's yesterday's news. You're living in the past. Stop living in the past.
It's fake news, Joshua. It's fake news.
Fake news. But yeah, basically, goodbye.
Yeah, we're just going to trail off now by going goodbye.
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 Just volcano.
Goodbye.
That's some good vocal fry.
Yeah, I like my jizz volcano to be vocally fried.
You've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. It is written, researched, and performed by Josh Addison, aka Monkey Fluids, and MRX Dentith, aka Conspiracism on Twitter. This podcast is available where all good podcasts can be found, as well as iTunes, Podbean, and Stitcher. It can also be watched on YouTube. Just search for the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, or, if you happen to be technophobic, consult the auguries. You can support the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy via our Patreon page, as listed in the podcast description, or just by searching for us on Patreon. You can also support us via the Podbean patronage system, if that is more your style. You do you. If you want to get in contact with us, why not email us at podcastconspiracy@gmail.com or find us on Facebook. And remember, Soylent Green is Meeples.